Okay, so now we're going to move on to the brain, its various parts, and their functions. The brain is divided into two main hemispheres, so the left and the right hemisphere. These are symmetrical halves that control the side of the body that is opposite of the location of the brain. So, in other words, the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. So, it controls the opposite side of the body of where it's located. And the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. Okay, so they control opposite sides. Certain behaviors are lateralized, which basically means that certain behaviors are more likely to reflect activity in one side of the brain or the other. So, for example, behaviors that involve language processing, so things like speaking, reading, thinking, comprehension, these often produce activity in the left side of the brain. So you're more likely to see the left hemisphere activated when you're engaging in these certain behaviors. Whereas behaviors not involving language, so things like understanding spatial relationships, music or art expression, recognition of patterns, these are going to produce activity in the right side of the brain. Okay, so when you engage in those behaviors, we're likely to see activity on the right side of the brain. So that's what we mean, or when we're referring to lateralization, we're just saying that certain parts of the brain are more active when you're engaging in certain behaviors. And then, of course, sorry, I forgot to mention, there are also four lobes of the brain. So we have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. So we're going to go into all of those in detail now. So, all this mass in the brain, the part that looks rippled and all these deep folds and curves and crevices, that is referred to, that whole thing is referred to as the cerebral cortex. And this part of the brain is what is largely responsible for the unique abilities we have as humans. Those abilities that separate us from other species. So, things like critical thinking, evaluation, complex judgments, language, and so on. So it's all that curvy part, all those kind of, what we think of when we think of a brain, right? With all the curvy, loopy parts and all the crevices. That is the cerebral cortex. And within that, there are four main lobes. There's the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. So the frontal lobe is just like the name suggests, it's at the front of the brain, and it is the largest of all of the four lobes. Okay. This lobe is mostly involved in planning and actually engaging in movement. So there's a section within the frontal lobe known as the motor area that actually maps out your body's voluntary movements, but we'll get into that in a few minutes. But I just want you to be aware that the motor area is located in the frontal lobe. All of the lobes are separated by these deep grooves known as sulci, but the groove separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, which is directly behind it, is known as the central sulcus. So just so you're aware. The parietal lobe, I don't know why that picture went away. Sorry about that. I wanted it to stay up. The parietal lobe is located directly behind the frontal lobe, and it's responsible for processing and integrating sensory information that is related to taste, temperature, and touch. So some of those sensory inputs we talked about at length in chapter 3, they're processed through this area, through the parietal lobe, which again is located right behind the frontal lobe. The occipital lobe is located at the back part of the skull. So we've got the frontal lobe, then behind that the parietal lobe, and then sort of at the back bottom end of the skull is the occipital lobe. And this is responsible for visual processing, mostly of flashes of light and colors. And then finally, we have the temporal lobe. And this is located right in front of the occipital lobe and kind of underneath the frontal lobe, right? So it's this smaller portion under the frontal lobe and then to the left of the occipital lobe. It's right above your ears, okay? It's right here in this little area right above your ears. And this area is primarily responsible for auditory processing. It's also the area that is thought to be responsible for humans understanding language. So Wernicke's area is located here in the temporal lobe, which we'll get into Wernicke's area in just a moment. Now, as I mentioned before, there's an area within the frontal lobe known as the motor area. So this is the part that is responsible for the body's voluntary movements, so the planning, controlling, and actual execution of movement comes from this area of the brain. This area has been really well mapped out. So it's this red portion that you see here in the frontal lobe. So this portion that's highlighted, that's what we're talking about, the motor area. It's really well mapped out, so much so that researchers have identified both the amount of tissue in this area and the location that will produce movements in very specific parts of the body. So every part of this motor area corresponds to a specific location in the body, such that if you stimulated a specific part of this motor area, a certain part of the body would move. And then if you stimulate a different area, another part of the body would move, and so on. And they found that to control of larger movements or movements that don't have to be really precise, they're centered in really tiny portions of the motor area. So because these movements, they're not precise, it doesn't take a lot to do them. Essentially, there's not a lot of tissue that takes up those movements. Okay, so things like moving your knee or moving your hip. These are precise, careful movements, and therefore not a lot of tissue is involved in making these movements happen. But much smaller movements that require precision or delicacy, so things like finger coordination or facial expressions, those are controlled by much larger areas of the motor area of the cortex, which makes sense, right? If a movement is very detailed, it requires a lot of precision. It takes up more brain tissue to make sure that you successfully carry out that movement. Versus a movement that's not very precise, it doesn't take much of the tissue to move that area, like moving your hip or your elbow or your knee. Okay. Now, we also have an area in the brain that corresponds to each of the senses. So this is known as the sensory area of the cortex, and it's located in the parietal lobe. There are three main regions of the sensory area in the cortex. So one corresponds primarily to body sensations, so things like touch and pressure. The second area or second region corresponds primarily to sight, so visual processing. And the third main region corresponds primarily to sound, so auditory processing. Now, similar to the motor area, which we just talked about, right, that's in the frontal lobe, same with the sensory area, the amount of brain tissue in the sensory area related to a particular location on the body determines how sensitive that location will or won't be. Okay, so for example, our fingers are the most sensitive to touch. If you think about all the nerve endings that are in your fingers and on your hands, Therefore, they're related to a larger part of the sensory area. Or, in other words, more tissue, there's more tissue that's involved um, or associated with those areas of the body that are more sensitive. Okay, so just like the motor area, the more delicate and the more precise your movements, the more brain tissue it takes. Same thing with the sensory area. The more sensitive to touch the area of the body is, the more brain tissue in the sensory area of the cortex it takes, okay, for those messages to be transmitted. And then we have the association area of the cortex. So this controls higher mental processes that humans engage in, such as language, thinking, memory, and speech, and so on. So those sort of higher mental processes. It's also responsible for executive functions like planning things, goal setting, making judgments, your impulse control or lack thereof. This is all, these functions are all associated with the association area of the cortex. Damage to this area can result in something called aphasia, which results in problems related to language, either understanding and or producing language. So there's actually two types of aphasia that can occur from damage in this area. The first is called Broca's aphasia. So this, of course, results from damage to Broca's area, and it results in the partial loss of the ability to produce language. So these individuals who have damage to this area or Broca's aphasia, they have trouble finding the right words. Their speech becomes really haltered. It's like a stop and go. It's pretty labor intensive. They have a really hard time producing words. It's very difficult for them. We see this often in individuals who have had a stroke. Sometimes individuals with brain injuries will have this happen. So it's the inability to produce language, not the ability to understand it, okay, but just to produce it. But damage to Wernicke's area is a little bit different. So this results in Wernicke's aphasia. And this produces difficulty with both understanding speech and producing it. So in these cases, speech sounds fluent, which is to say that they don't stop and go, they don't have trouble finding words, they don't stop or hesitate, so their language flows, okay? But the words that they're using and that they're putting together don't make any logical sense, okay? They're just random jumble of words that are being strung together in sentences, but they don't make sense, okay? So different from Broca's aphasia, they're speaking fluently, their language flows, they would sound like you or I when we're talking, but their words don't go together, okay? They don't make sense. They can't put accurate words together for what they want to say. So I just wanted to show you a picture of Broca's area. So here it's located in the frontal lobe, and then Wernicke's area is located back here in the temporal lobe towards the back of the skull. So these are the two areas that can become damaged and then affect speech, right? So understanding and producing speech. So these are the areas of the brain where those are located. And here's an image that just shows all of the areas we have just talked about. So there on the left, you have the frontal lobe where the motor area is located. And of course, Broca's area is also located here. So that's the biggest lobe of the four, and it's located at the front of the brain. Right behind that, we have the parietal lobe, where the sensory areas are located. So for processing sensation that we talked about, so touch, temperature, and taste. And then kind of underneath and behind that, we have the temporal lobe, which is the primary auditory area. And this is where Wernicke's area is also located. And then finally, if you keep curving around to right here on top of the ear, you have the occipital lobe. Okay, and that's the primary visual area of the brain.